Welcome to Moments of Leadership. Today, my guest is Sergeant Major Donald Reynolds. He's former 0331 machine gunner, 0369 infantry unit leader, and obviously an 8999 to those listeners in the know as a sergeant major. Many know him on Instagram as Norseman_9, where he posts some of the best and most encouraging insights on both training and combat leadership that I've been reading, and has really set the standard for using social media as a leadership tool. He's from Pennsylvania, and he enlisted in the Marine Corps in July of 2000 and graduated from Marine Corps Recruit Depot Parris Island in October of 2000. In December of 2000, then Private Reynolds reported to Lima 3-2 and completed 2 combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. In January of 2005, then Sergeant Reynolds checked into Echo Company, 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines, for the battalion's deployment to Fallujah, Iraq. February of 2008, still then Sergeant Reynolds received orders to go to Bravo Company 1-4, where he completed another deployment to Fallujah. And then April of 2012, he was meritoriously promoted to the rank of gunnery sergeant and received orders to 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, and completed a combat deployment to Afghanistan as a team chief for an Afghan border police advisory team, and then did a 31st MU deployment as the company gunnery sergeant for Fox Company. And then during his time with 2-4, he was the recipient of both the Sergeant Major Joseph Ellis Leadership Award and the 3MEF Commanding General's Leadership Award. Selected for promotion in December of 2015, Gunnery Sergeant Reynolds was frocked to the rank of First Sergeant and assigned to India Company 37, RA, where he completed a Special Purpose MAGTF deployment to the CENTCOM region as the Crisis Response Company's First Sergeant. Then October of 2017, First Sergeant Reynolds served as the First Sergeant for 2 companies at Marine Corps Communications and Electronics School. And then in 2019, First Sergeant Reynolds received orders to the School of Infantry West, where he served as the company First Sergeant for Infantry Unit Leaders Training Company, and then as the Director, Marine Combat Instructor School. Finally selected for promotion to Sergeant Major in November of 2020. He was frocked to his present rank in January of 2021 and was assigned as the Sergeant Major for Recruiting Station Twin Cities in February of 2021. Sergeant Major Reynolds' personal awards include the Meritorious Service Medal, Navy Commendation Medal with 3 gold stars, Navy Achievement Medal with 1 silver star, 1 combat V distinguishing device, and of course the Combat Action Ribbon. Sergeant Major Reynolds is married to the former Daniel Pencock and the proud parents of 2 children, Ella and Leo. Sergeant Major Reynolds, welcome to Moments of Leadership.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you on. It's, this is really the first time we've spoken face to face, I guess, through video. So you and I got to know each other on Instagram, and I just immediately fell in love with everything that you were writing and posting on there. I just thought it was fantastic. And, I'll just start off with the first question. We all start out in the military as either an E1 or an O1, or I'm kind of making this up, but really only 1% of us ever make it to that senior enlisted rank, the 25, 30, 40-year mark. Tell me some of the stories that you remember about the NCOs that you had when you checked into Lima Company 3-2 as a young 0331 that were impactful when you deployed to combat for the first time. Like, were there any crystallizing moments, any of those aha moments that just stayed with you forever?
There's plenty. So to start off with, I did not have the best first experience as a Marine, and I was my high school senior year. I had spent the summer before that in a juvenile detention center. I got in a lot of trouble. So when the Marine Corps recruiter saw me walking through the high school at the beginning of the year, I looked like a punk. If you can imagine the late 90s, baggy pants, So he walked up to me, and I guess he could just tell by looking at me. He said, what do you plan to do when you graduate? And he handed me the Marine recruiter card. And I said, I looked at it, I laughed, and I flicked it back at him. And I said, no, thanks. I grew up in a house with extreme discipline. My father was a disciplinarian. So I had always, and my dad was a biker. So he was a big man. So my idea of discipline was always, the first thing was an impressive physical presence. So when I joined the Marines, I went UA my first Liberty weekend, and I got NJP'd, and I really didn't have a good understanding of, what I was a part of. And we got a brand new set of staff NCOs in my 1st Battalion, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, and they were exactly what I needed. So they were classic example of a military professional. So back then, combat action ribbons were extremely hard to come by. So you'd see these staff NCOs that had a combat action ribbon, they were automatically revered. They were almost like unicorns when you would see them. So that meant that they had done a Desert Storm deployment. A lot of these guys were Somali veterans. So they all had these combat action ribbons. And then on top of that is that they were all former drill instructors. And on top of being former drill instructors, they were also had served in reconnaissance battalions or were in scout sniper platoons. So at that time, during peacetime Marine Corps, it was indicative of a guy that routinely sought out difficult assignments. So what I learned from them is that you don't get to pick where you invest your efforts or what orders you get to choose to follow. You apply yourself in all areas, from the way these guys wore their uniforms, the cleanliness of, how they demanded how we kept our rooms, the maintenance of our weapons and our gear, all the way down to how to prepare a squad for patrol. They were just as comfortable teaching a class on close order drill as they were teaching a class on ambushes. These guys were truly experts in every aspect of the military. And today you kind of have like a counterculture that pushes back against the organizational discipline, like shaves, haircuts, uniforms, and all that attention to detail stuff. A lot of Marines have a problem with it or say this won't impact me in combat. A lot of younger Marines throw out examples of a guy who prioritizes things solely like drill and ceremonies, uniforms, or like military protocol and doesn't know anything about his own MOS field. These guys taught me to be proficient in all things, or at least strive to be proficient in all things. So they were incredibly disciplined, physically fit, tactically and technically proficient, and they showed up to work every day looking like $1 million. To this day, those guys, that first crop of staff NCOs and NCOs that I worked with in Lima 3-2 are kind of how I measure myself now, even as a sergeant major. I think of at times before I'm about to do or not do something, what these guys would say to me. They were incredibly demanding and they were intense without being brutal or sadistic. They just had a bubble of correctness around them. You either fixed yourself or you got crushed. And they were able to tie organizational discipline and the tactical relevance for me. They were like the classic examples of tough love, which I think a lot of Marines appreciate and actually seek out when it comes from the right person. Case in point, I was a machine gun section leader in the invasion. And if you've ever seen a rifle company dug in the middle of the desert where there's nothing, it covers quite a large portion of terrain, right? So I would walk the lines at night with my lieutenant and check on the machine gunners. And our gun that was assigned the PDF in the defense was right in front of 2nd Platoon's position. And the 2nd Platoon sergeant was a stickler for tactical protocol, right? So he would see me in the hole. The machine gun hole was directly in front of his hole. So he'd see me creep up at like 2 a.m. I'd jump in the hole. I'd be checking range cards with my guys. And I had my own little 119. He'd call over the radio and he'd say, hey, my call sign was Hammer Guns. And he'd say, Hammer Guns, did you request permission to enter my portion of the lines? And you would say, I'm already behind the line, Staff Sergeant. And he'd say, get out, go back and try it again. So he'd be like, and you would, jump out of the hole. You'd walk back, to 1st Platoon sector of the lines. You'd call on and say, Hammer 2, this is Hammer Guns, request permission to enter your portion of the lines. He'd say, hey, come on in, Reynolds, and then you'd walk in and you would go do it. But, that kind of stuff, that guy paid a lot of attention to me and kind of messed with me because he really liked me. And those guys were so intense, so demanding that sort of attention I was perfectly okay with because it was like they see me, you know what I mean? They're talking to me and they're always trying to make me better. So that's like my pre-war guys, the guys that kind of showed me before war, the things when we were running around, kind of just training in the field, still back at pressing our uniforms, shining your boots and stuff like that. Those were the guys that really impressed me. And as I became a small unit leader, I had people like Sergeant Major Brian Zickafus, who just recently retired. He was my company first sergeant. He was the heart and soul of our company. So when I came back in the Marine Corps, I got out and came back in. He was our company first sergeant. He was a former scout sniper from Desert Storm, Silver Star recipient. He was a hero to the Marines. And he was that first guy who was, he looked like he was more comfortable in the field getting dirty with the Marines than he was sitting in an office somewhere. There was no doubt that he was the senior Marine in the company. He wasn't just a fit rep and NJP guy. He was the guy responsible for the discipline, cohesion, and performance of the team. When we got to Fallujah, he had a rule, and the rule was he would observe every squad leader's prep for combat phase before they went out on patrol. So the way the company operated then was you'd have like 3 or 4 squads, 8 to 12 men out patrolling at any hour of the day, all day. So you have guys that are, 19, 20, 21, 22 out leading these patrols, and they're the only ones out side friendly line. So his thing was he would observe and watch you get ready to go. Didn't matter what time of day, you were allowed to walk into his hooch and shake him awake and say, "First Sergeant, I'm about ready to give my order." He would come out, he would take notes, he would watch you give the order, he'd watch you inspect your Marines, he'd watch you do your mission card, he'd watch you issue out pyro, he'd watch you do your rehearsals, and then you would depart friendly lines. And kind of like a stamp of approval would be if you went into his hooch the second time you went out and said, "First Sergeant, about ready to give my order," he would say, "Hey, you're good." That meant he was comfortable and he was confident in your abilities to get ready to go out. He would also go on patrol with us. And when he would go on patrol with us, he filled a role just like another rifleman. So you had a guy that had been in the Marine Corps since the late 80s, scout sniper instructor. And he would come out on patrol and you could look at him and say, "Hey, First Sergeant, I need you to pick up this sector of fire." Or, "Hey, First Sergeant, I need you to go pick up a security position, over there on the corner." And he would do it. He could have very easily came out and kind of took over the patrol or created a whole bunch of confusion by being out there or making the squad leader nervous because, the First Sergeant's now there. And I realized that he taught me that type of leadership, showing that you're willing to go out and get your hands dirty with the Marines, share the risk with your Marines. No one's above that, no matter what their station is in life. And the fact that he could have gone out and done that, but he subordinated himself. That's the right word. He subordinated himself to kind of pick the Marines up, right? The Marine obviously feels good because he's out there and his First Sergeant's responding to his orders because he's the squad leader. Made that billet, made that Marine feel important, and the Marines loved him for it. And then the last would be, and I think this ties into the later on question, is Sergeant Major Jeff Dagenhart, who was a Super Squad winner both coasts. He got injured in Iraq and he rehabilitated his hip, and he came back to the company and he took over as our company gunnery sergeant. So he had convinced the monitor that he was good to go. If you looked up Marine gunnery sergeant in the dictionary, it would be this guy. He was the classic example. I'll never forget, on a very long battalion hike, he took a liking to me. He called me to the rear of the formation. He's like, "Hey, come back here." So I did. And I'm like, "What's going on, Gunny?" He's like, "I'm throwing right now." It was like a long hike. We're coming up River Road in Camp Lejeune. We're coming close to 6 Marines. And he's like, I thought he just wanted to talk to me. He's like, "I'm having a really hard time right now." And he's gritting his teeth. And he's like, "Motivate me." So I was, so I'm like, "Let's go, Gunny," and he's like, there was a Marine that had fallen out right as we were about to break right at the 6th Marine Regimental headquarters and head back into the battalion area. Our battalion sergeant major told him, like, "Hey, I'm not going to take you on deployment if you can't, you can't do your job with the company," right? So that's what the gunny was kind of sweating. So he sees this kid laying there and he's like, "Help me pick this kid up." So we picked this kid up, this kid that's prostrate. He fell out, we throw him on the gunny's pack. And my gunny's like comes walking up. The whole battalion, we went straight into formation. So they come in from the hike and we go straight into a battalion formation. Battalion sergeant major standing out front, and my gunny comes walking up to the front of the formation in front of all the Marines with this like hike drop, and he drops them at the sergeant major's feet. So and he's like, "Look," and looks at the sergeant major, like, "I told you I'd be good. I told you I could deploy," and he walks back. He was a guy that so everybody taught me kind of, at the beginning, I learned attention to detail and that military professional, the type of things that you think about when you think Marine. And then, from guys like Zika, I learned how that kind of ties into, being humble and, humility and being confident in yourself and just being there for sharing the risk. And then from Dagenhart, I learned he was just so organized. He was tactically and technically proficient. So all that stuff, that Dagenhart helped me kind of zero my scope in on how to be a proficient infantry unit leader and tie all those things together. That guy is probably, the most influential Marine I've ever served with. So
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I want to rewind a little bit because you hit real quick that you had gotten in trouble on your very first Liberty weekend.
Oh, yeah.
Was that after you checked into 3-2 or?
It was. So there's
okay.
So it was after I checked into 3-2. So I really didn't put much thought in joining the Marines. The Marines were, it was before, it was 2000, but it's before smartphones, before all this stuff, right? So like I said, I grew up really, really disciplined. My father was a disciplinarian. He was also a biker, right? So imagine he looked like a combination of Hulk Hogan and Dog the Bounty Hunter. Okay, like long blonde hair guy, So I rebelled.
That's a tough entrance into an infantry company, right? You show up.
It sure is. It sure is. So
you're you.
I guess my point is I graduated from boot camp, and boot camp kind of washed over me, right? So because I was used to discipline, and I couldn't tie it together, right? So I thought that I had made the biggest mistake of my life joining the Marines. I was one of those guys that if you saw me on Liberty and, the whole point was to not look like a Marine, right? So I thought that would be cool, as if someone would look at me and say like, not be able to tie military service and me together as, as a brand new Marine, right? I was one of those guys. Had a girlfriend at the time, and our first Liberty weekend, the first 96, she convinced me to stay when I should have met my ride back to Camp Lejeune, right? So I stayed and I, partied and I did whatever. And I woke up the next morning and I figured I might as well turn this into a couple more days, right? So my company first sergeant called my home and my father answered the phone and my father was livid. He's like, get out, my dad thought at the time that that the Marine Corps was going to send a hit team to the house, and kick in the back door and drag me out, So I went back and it was really, really tough. And I was NJP'd and,
So busted or just,
yes. Oh, I got busted. My first sergeant met me at the Camp Lejeune, at the Jacksonville bus, the Greyhound bus station with two NCOs. And I mean, the second I came off that bus, they were all over me.
So that back down to E1 then?
So I never even made it past E1. I mean, literally, this was my first 96 as a private check-in in from SOY. Right.
Wow. Okay. So
yes,
nowhere lower to go.
No, coming in with a bang too.
Yeah. So that's really that's the heart of the story I want to get to. So you check into an infantry company, right? And you get in trouble. And this is pre-invasion, right? This combat was not on the horizon.
No.
Pre 9/11.
January 2001.
Okay. So I'm curious. I want to hear how you remember as a E1, right, in trouble. How did the NCOs lead you out of that mistake? Were they supportive? Did you feel like, hey, these guys are, going to give me a second chance? Like what was your mental state? Because I think a lot of people who listen to this can probably relate to having gotten in trouble at some point in their career. As a matter of fact, every single guest that's ever been on this podcast has told some story about how they got in trouble and they've ended up becoming very successful career service members. So there must have been some sort of encouragement. Some NCO must have said like, hey, listen, here's the path forward. Tell me if that happened to you.
Well, so what happened with me was a lot of times when a Marine screws something up, there's a mitigating factor. So you'll have a guy that messes something up and you can actually look at his record or look at what he's done and said well, he's done really great. Other times he just made a mistake, right? For me, I was so new that there was no mitigating circumstances, right? So essentially I was a wash. I was a punk private that checked in from SOY, had done nothing in the fleet and already got in trouble, right? So I remember conducting my CCU, for those that remember that, Correctional Custodies Unit was still a thing. And I was kind of like a punk. And I remember I got brought in for NJP and my company commander was my first sergeant standing there. It's in the old Camp Lejeune offices. So the offices were very, very small. And I'm standing in my company commander's office and they're giving, we're going through NJP. And I had no idea what was really going on. It just stood there. And I think my body language, the way my bearing was so disgusting. But once he mentioned CCU and I had no idea what CCU was, my first sergeant started laughing. I was like, oh, you think you know it all now, don't you? He's like, CCU, that's for, so I was deathly afraid of CCU. My company commander said, you know what? You are so new. You don't know anything. He's like, you are the most disgusting example of a Marine that I've received yet. He's like, but I don't even think you know what you're doing right now, So they gave me 14 and 14, but what really, I was pulled out of my platoon. So because I hadn't even done anything yet to get assigned to a platoon.
Right.
So I did EPD, so cleanup, and then I would report to the battalion police sergeant's office during the day. So all I was the guy that picked up cigarette butts and did working parties around the battalion. And I was initially fine with that. I'm not gonna lie to you. I was fine with that. The NCO, because I kind of hoped that they would kick me out of the Marine Corps. The NCOs didn't really give me the time of day except for one or two, right? And they happened to be from my home of record. So there was some common ground. We were all from Pennsylvania, around the Philadelphia area. And they didn't convince me to change my act. They were just nice to me. I mean, at that time, when you're during that era as a young Marine, you just spent your whole day in a daze of saying, yes, Lance Corporal, no, Lance Corporal, and standing at parade rest. We really didn't know what was going on. Those guys kind of treated me decently. So much time went by. I said to myself, I'm either going to, honor my commitment because I'm sick of picking up cigarette butts. I'm sick of getting put on working parties. I'm not going to get kicked out of the Marine Corps. I might as well just make this work. And it was really, really hard. But, the best thing that happened to me was we got a nasty corporal that checked in, right? And this guy was just, yeah, he just was petty and harass. He's the type of guy, he would see me on a Tuesday and say, "Hey, Reynolds, field day is Thursday, right?" I said, "Yes." And he goes, "You'd fail." So he'd fail you on a Tuesday for a field day that didn't even happen yet. He'd say, "I'll be by your room at 02 or something like that." I figured this out. The quickest way to get revenge on people that, kind of cast their judgment on you or say that you're worthless, right, is to outwork them. So I got so sick of hearing the trash talk, or kind of being, like my nickname was like, "Hey, you a piece of shit," right? So they'd be like, "Hey, you a piece of shit, come over here," right? I got so sick of that I put my head down and I thought the only way that you can get revenge on a guy that's calling you like, "Hey, come here, you a piece of shit," is to step over him while you're hiking the 240 and he's falling out and he's lying prostrate on the ground on a battalion hike. The only way to get revenge on and say, "Oorah, Corporal," as you're stepping over him, right? Or the only way you can get revenge is by having the quickest gun drill, by being the most physically fit. So really what happened is that, those two guys from my home of record, the senior Marines that were nice to me, kind of like gave me a safe space to go to at night. I could kind of sit in there and talk to them about like stuff outside the Marine Corps. But primarily this one rotten corporal, my section leader, was the one that I just put my head down. I was PTing after work. I was reading pubs. I was doing all sorts of things. And by the time midway through my first deployment to Okinawa, I was recommended for meritorious corporal.
Nice.
And I got it. So now I'm the same rank as this guy that was once tormenting me. And it was great because, the command wrote a letter to my father. My platoon commander wrote a letter to my father saying, like, "I know your son started off like on the worst possible circumstances, but I want to let you know what your son's up to now. I made my family proud." And, once I gave the Marine Corps a chance and stopped trying to worry about what was going on at home or my girlfriends or what my buddies were doing, I loved it. I loved it.
Yeah, I love the story about how the platoon commander wrote your folks a letter. I don't know if that's commonplace these days. I did it once on a deployment, wrote every parent a letter. Just I was on ship and had plenty of time to do it. I don't know. Again, I don't know if that's commonplace. Boy, I'll tell you, I will encourage people who are listening to seriously consider that, whether you're an officer or enlisted, if you've got men or women underneath you and you're in charge of them, writing their folks a letter, just saying that they're doing a great job, just unbelievable for the folks. And, great PR for the Marine Corps as well. But I won't digress much more than that, but I think it's great.
I think so too.
Okay. So meritorious corporal,
yes.
Right? That's an achievement in the infantry community.
I thought so. And it was back in the day where it was, we would do like the O course, we do a PFC, there was a knowledge board, and there was, you walk into a room and you've got the battalion sergeant major in the center and you've got all the first sergeants flanking him and they each pepper you with two questions each. And it went everything from the UCMJ to demonstrate the firing positions with the saw, guide on, it was everything, right? So back when you pressed your uniforms, all that stuff. So it was really, I was very, very proud when I saw that I had gotten selected.
Yeah, that's, and, having seen meritorious boards go from the officer side, I just know that they're few and far between. For somebody to get picked up for meritorious corporal is a huge achievement. I'll bet you feel better or as equally proud about that as any personal award that you have on your uniform. I can just tell that because you just told the story. But I'm curious now. So you're a corporal now, and then tell me about Corporal Reynolds standing in formation right after 9/11, because nobody in that battalion had probably been to combat in at least a decade. Probably, I mean, if anybody had served in combat, it was probably either Desert Storm or Somalia at that point. So I'm going to make the assumption that no one under the rank of staff sergeant had any combat experience. And now somebody comes out to formation and says, "Get your shit ready, we're going to war." What was that like?
So we had, our first sergeant had deployed to Desert Storm, and a couple of the staff NCOs had deployed to Somalia. We had one staff sergeant. His name was Staff Sergeant Dave Parker, and he was the anomaly out of all of them, right? So I told you that whole story about how we had, these very physically fit, poster board image, drill instructor, reconnaissance, scout sniper, all the boxes checked, cut yourselves on the crease of their camis type staff NCOs. And then there was Dave Parker. And Dave Parker was the guy that he looked kind of like Robin Williams. He was the guy, did you ever see the Marines back in the day that would hand sew their own name tapes on? to their camis, right?
Yes.
And it looked kind of crappy. He was a guy that he would buff shine his boots, vice spit shining, right? The thing about him was he was the genuine article. That guy had served in pretty much every infantry regiment and reconnaissance battalion since, I think he showed me his service record book. He had C school in his service record book. So he was part of that group that went to security forces to get assigned to ship duty.
Ships,
that's
right?
How long
Yeah,
he'd been.
the guard the nuclear weapons, right?
Right. That's how long he'd been in the Marine Corps, and then Panama, Somalia, like he had done it all. Right. He was a mule packer in Bridgeport. So like the story about this guy was he was the total opposite of all these like very aggressive staff NCOs, but nobody messed with him. They kind of gave him like his space, and he was he never yelled, he never screamed. He was the guy when we went to jungle warfare training. He disappeared into the woods with some 550 cord, and he came back an hour later carrying 2 wild pigs that he had snared, and we cut him up and cooked him. Like, I mean, he was just when you think Field Marine, it's this guy. So he was the guy that had the most combat experience then, and he didn't really say much. He was like everybody else was kind of beating their chest and talking about their experiences in Desert Storm, trying to talk about what war was like. He was really quiet, but there's a story later on that I'll probably tell where he really comes to the forefront. But yeah, for the most part, no one knew what to expect. No one really knew what we were going to be doing. And I tell Marines this all the time. The possibility that we would go to war seems so foreign. Even when, we could get on a ship, they could give us ammo. And, in my mind, I thought they're going to call us back at the last minute. It's going to be stand down or whatever. I remember saying to my mother the day after September 11th, I called my mother on the barracks payphone, and she was very concerned about me. And I said, Mom, are you kidding me? We're never going to do anything. Right. And, lo and behold, she still reminds me of that to this day. So essentially a lot of people running around doing things that they thought would get them ready for combat. Some good, some not so good.
So Dave Parker, he was your platoon sergeant?
Nah, that's the story in and of itself. So if you want me to,
I'm guessing not.
Well, so here's what happened. So we finally did. So we went to Kuwait. We got off, we got on the USS Bataan. We floated over. And my platoon sergeant was a gunnery sergeant who had come to the battalion after our first deployment. So he was not part of that crew of staff NCOs that I just spoke so highly about. I don't know. Hindsight's 2020. Maybe, as an older guy now, maybe he had problems in his personal life. I don't know. I can only tell you what it looked like from my perspective as a junior Marine, right? Which is something that, is a learning point in and of itself. But he never participated in anything. He was always yelling and screaming. He did little things like you would get your ice resupply at CAX, and he wouldn't give it out to the Marines. He would keep it for himself, and he'd put his Camelback on top of it in the cooler, right, to keep his water cold. And then in the morning, we'd watch him dump out all this ice while we were like baking in the defense. He would just, he had no interaction with the Marines other than, kind of yelling at them, right? So, you saw him in the morning at formation, he'd yell at you, you'd go about your day. At the end of the day, he'd yell at you. We did a hike in Okinawa, and our platoon commander took us out. We were hiking around Schwab, and he had enough of the hike, and he said, "Screw this," and he walked away, right? And he left the Marines, and it was just a bad circumstance, right? Because you think and you go well, that was like a 23-year-old lieutenant kind of dealing with a guy that's 10, 15 years older than him, 10, 15 years more time in the Marine Corps than him, right? And that officer's put in a position like that officer does, most officers aren't going to turn around and grab that gun and be like, what are you doing? Get back in formation. They're just going to kind of stand there and let this guy kind of do whatever he wants because, like it or not, that's a situation that most aren't prepared for, nor should they be, right? So he was our platoon sergeant for Iraq. The day we got in the trucks to start the movement north, he was in my truck, machine gun section leader. He sat next to me and he was just kind of going on and on about how this war was stupid and we're going to die and, all this other stuff. And it was really, really strange. He degraded so much over time so that the first little portion of the invasion, we crossed the border and we didn't see a whole lot of anything except wide open desert. We were following and trace of 1st Marine Division. And day by day, he would just get weirder and weirder. He stopped shaving. He stopped resupplying the Marines. He insisted that I call him by his first name. We stopped right outside of An Nazariya, Iraq, and we were digging in. We started taking mortar fire, and I'm with the machine gunners. We're setting up our positions, and he was back with the mortars, and he calls me over the radio, and he says, I need you back at my position. So I go running back to his position. Now, I mean, it's not, mortars were landing, but I'm not going to play this up and make it sound like this was some sort of like Vietnam or platoon scenario, right? I mean, but I run as fast as I can back there to him. I jump into the mortar hole and I'm like, Gunny, what do you need? And he goes, my cigarettes are in the truck. Can you go grab them? I'm like, Gunny, you called me here during mortar fire to get you your cigarettes, So make a long story short is that evening we sat outside Aunt Nazaria and, the 1-2 got into it. 1-2 sustained some casualties. So the very next day we were told that we were going to go in, and my platoon commander came and was giving us an order. And, the platoon commander for weapons platoon normally is the FIS team leader as well. So he had this giant battle board. So he takes the battle board and they're covered in plexiglass. He kind of drops it in the sand and starts giving a quick frago of what we were going to do. The gunny's muttering under his breath, and the lieutenant finally is like had enough and says, Gunny, you have something you want to add? And the gunny picks up the map and chucks it. He throws it and he says, this is suicide. I'm not going. Right. So they could not convince the gunny to get on the truck. He walked away, refused to go on the mission. So now you have a weapons platoon that's leaderless going into this was our first combat. Up to that point, nothing had happened to us, except for that mortar attack that we took the first day when we were digging in. So now we were actually going to go into the attack, and our gunny was like, I'm not going. Right. So what was interesting was you could look at that and you could say, like, that's terrible, right? Marines could walk, but you're not going to tell you that incident was meaningless because Dave Parker, that staff sergeant that I'm telling you about, that guy that had cut his teeth in all these recon battalions or whatever, the guy with not the greatest uniform, not the best haircut, stepped up and covered 3rd platoon and weapons platoon. So the joke was we called ourselves Task Force Parker. This guy ran 2 platoons in combat, okay, and took care of all of us. So, you have this thing where you say, sometimes you can look at it and say, 2 things I took from this, right? You can look at it and say, here's what happened in my deployment. My gunny walked away. Or you can turn around and say, extreme circumstances bring out the worst and best in people. And that's the beauty of this kind of this environment that we operate in as a Marine Corps. Like, yeah, you may see something like that, but you're going to see leadership. You're going to come out of the most unlikely places, and you're going to see someone step up and really do incredible things, which is what Parker did. And the other thing that I learned from this is that as I got older in the Marines, I really pay attention to staff NCO and officer relationships, especially as a company first sergeant, a company gunny. I am like keenly aware of the relationship between the platoon commander and the platoon sergeant, because I often think all the time about what it must have felt like to be that lieutenant that's dealing with this military professional, this guy that's supposed to advise him, this guy that's supposed to kind of show him the ropes and help him through some of the things that he's never seen before due to his experience, and have this guy be a complete liability and put this lieutenant in a position every single day where he's trying to do the right thing, but he's fighting with the guy that's supposed to be his counterpart, just to get up and do his job and take care of the Marines. So, and the amount of turmoil that must have brought that lieutenant. So it's something that I watch constantly, because I think it's unfair to a junior officer to get paired up with a seasoned Marine like that and have it be. And, obviously you can see that if you ever come across an officer that, has some issues with trust or micromanagement or whatever, Marines will turn around and say, oh, he's got an ego. I don't believe that. I think if you were to peel the onion back, I think that in most cases, they were burned by a staff non-commissioned officer or counterpart when they first, their early experiences with a enlisted Marine staff NCO was unfavorable. So something that, continues to feed itself.
I want to spend a few minutes digging in on a couple questions on that scenario that you just told us about, because I have some questions about, from your perspective, because you're a corporal, right? From your perspective, did Dave Parker just emerge out of the smoke as this leader and say, I am taking over Task Force Parker right now with 3rd Platoon and Weapons Platoon? Was that your perspective? Or was there sort of like, because where was the lieutenant? Where was the company first sergeant? Where was the company commander with all that drama going on with this guy? Because it couldn't have been just Corporal Reynolds that saw it. Everybody had to see it. So what was the catalyst for the inaction in keeping that shitbird around?
I can only look back on it now. Because the same question that I have, right? Because you would think that I would say that I don't know. Maybe the lieutenant was saying that he's good, I got it, or maybe this wasn't getting reported. I definitely don't think that it was the type of environment back then where a corporal would feel comfortable walking up to, the company commander and saying, I got to tell you about this guy, right? You kind of just did you did your part.
That's fair. Right.
And for a while, he was so eccentric with the yell. He had this crazy hot, shrill voice, right? He was so eccentric that I think that they thought it was funny at first, right? I don't think anybody really quite could piece together. I think they thought he might have had some character flaws. I don't think anybody would have been able to tell that he would, not go on the mission, or refuse to go on a mission. I don't think anybody thought it would get that deep. And then also in the early days of the invasion, the company is just, things are moving so faster, and the situation was like continuously evolving. I don't know, because we had great leadership. We had a great first sergeant, a great company commander. I don't know how keyed in they were on him, because I think that their attention was elsewhere. And I also think with weapons platoon, the Marines are usually attached out and part of other platoons. So I also think that it could have been a case of, I'm stuck with this guy. We're in the middle of combat, right? So at least he's in a platoon where, his presence, it would have been a lot worse if he was leading a rifle platoon or at the forefront of a rifle platoon. So I don't know. I do know this, though, is that Parker didn't come from Parker was the guy that, like I said, I agree that I'm one of the, you can see me right now. I got a high and tight haircut. My uniform is, squared away, right? I am one of the guys that truly believes, like, you've got to like do your best in all areas, right? So like my uniform's always correct. I always have a haircut. I'm physically fit, all those things. Parker was all those things. Parker just, as well as I do, like back then guys walked around, their uniforms used to crunch, right, with the starch, right?
Yeah, right, with the starch. Mm-hmm.
Right. Parker was a little bit different because he'd steam press his uniform. He'd buff shine and stuff, right? So he wasn't, like spit and polish. But he was the genuine article. So everybody kind of knew that he had all the street cred in the world, but it was an opportunity for him. Or it's actually kind of interesting because of all these guys that had done all these things and were these great images of the Marine Corps. It's like, who are we going to give the guy to run 2 platoons? We're going to give it to Staff Sergeant Parker, and he was to be honest with you, he was a terminal staff sergeant. He got out of the Marine Corps as a staff sergeant, right? I think in 2006, he got out of the Marine Corps as a staff sergeant, but it's like he was a calming effect on those Marines. Like he had this, I think he's from West Virginia. He had this accent where he would just, and very, very calmly, like when we were taking mortar fire, I would say, gentlemen, that's incoming mortar fire. You might want to take cover, right? And everybody was just kind of like, he was calm. So as long as Parker was with you, as long as Parker was good, you knew everything was going to be okay, right?
Yeah.
He was that guy.
I love those stories. And here's why, because, and I've said this before on other episodes, but if I was given the opportunity to rewind my career, if somebody said to me, what's the one thing you would do a do-over on? I would say getting upset and yelling. So counterproductive. I didn't know it when I was 22, 23 years old. You probably didn't know it when you were a corporal either. But boy, if people are listening out there, I just think that there is so much more leadership that is exuded in a calm voice where you can articulate using real words and communicate with people why you're displeased with something, why it didn't meet your expectations, rather than just going off like, 4th of July fireworks. And you just kind of reinforce that perspective that I have now about, and I really wish that I had a do-over on that. And, like officers really aren't screamers. They shouldn't be, but like, which makes me feel like even the little bit that I did, I really regret it. And Lieutenant General Bellin was just on, he told a story about how he lost his temper one time out in the field too. And he regrets it. And then to hear you tell a story about, the great leader of Task Force Parker, just standing around saying, gentlemen, you may want to take some cover. It's one of those. And I'll also take a second because this hasn't come up before, but let's just take 3 minutes and just talk about the nostalgia of the old uniforms that most people don't even understand these days. I mean, for listeners who don't know what we're talking about, this was before the Digi camis came out. We had the old Woodland camis, which again, somehow are cool again with the special ops guys, I guess.
Sure.
But, we used to have to take them to the dry cleaners and have them pressed. And you would go to like the dry cleaners. If you took your camis to the dry cleaner in your hometown and wherever it isn't around a Marine Corps base, they're not going to press them right. Like the dry cleaners have, and it's like heavy starch. And when you get them, they are literally, the trousers were literally like cardboard, and you had to stick your hand down each leg of the trouser just to separate the material to get your leg down into it. And we would starch those things within an inch of their lives. And then after a while, the starch would wear out and the camis could still ostensibly be clean and serviced. You're like, okay, but the minute the pockets separated away or anything like that, is just, and watching people just the boots and starching their covers and starching their utilities. It brings, when you said it, like I had this flashback of just putting my camis on Monday morning and putting my hand down the cam. Right. And then the guys that would walk around and not really press their camis, and you had this little like, oh, what a piece of shit that guy is.
Yeah.
But,
right.
They're probably like, Dave Parker, right? Just
I remember the guys would, all the little things that they would do, they'd sew their pockets shut, or to have the tightest sleeves, they would cut the long sleeves off. So there'd be half of that. So they'd have a flatter roll. Those were the summertime camis.
That's right.
Like fishing line in the seams to keep it like, just a guy. I think one guy told me one time that he baked his boots to keep like the shine. So you shine them, you put them in the oven, like all the things guys did for their uniforms back then. Right.
Oh yeah. It was nuts.
Right. Yeah. So, I try not to talk about that much around like junior Marines, because it does sound ridiculous where it's like, okay, you talk about making sure your uniform squared away and pressing it and doing all those things. But it's also like, the guy's like, well, I wouldn't, are you telling me it's a good thing that you spent your Sunday with your boots in the oven trying to get the,
right.
So
it is some nostalgia though. It's fun to talk to,
for
somebody
sure.
else who knows exactly what you're talking about. And,
for sure.
Yeah. And I'm sure you also remember ironing on the pocket, the eagle lobe and anchor on the front of the pocket. You had to iron that on. It didn't come on there. Like,
and if you got it wrong, they were unserviceable. If you got them wrong, it was unserviceable.
You could go out and buy a brand new cami blouse and it would have nothing on it. And you would have to iron that and before name tapes. So even before name tapes, you would have to iron on the EG&A and it said USMC underneath it. And it had these dotted lines where you're supposed to cut the piece of paper out. And some people would you'd see them and they'd iron the dotted lines onto their pockets too, and unserviceable, Anyway, good nostalgia, good catch up on some funny old stuff.
Yep.
I still have those old camis around here somewhere. I just can't. My black boots, I just can't bring myself to throw them out. My wife says, why don't you get rid of this stuff? I'm like, are you kidding me? You know how many places those boots have trampled around the world?
Well, last thing was that a Marine thought I photoshopped. I posted a picture on Instagram, and it was me getting an award as a corporal. And it was during that time period where the Marine Corps was transitioning out of tricolors and into digis, right? So there was a period where you wore both. You'd see Marines in both. So the guy thought I photoshopped it. He's like, why is everybody in a different uniform? Like a guy thought that this was fake. He couldn't understand, Marines. Right,
Marines
because
don't know back then, I think they issued them out in stages, I think. And you could also wear the new camis with the black boots. There was also that too, because there weren't enough of the tan boots going around.
Yeah, from what I remember, it was open at first. The first purchases were open to like staff NCOs and officers at the Lejeune PX, and it was like very hard to come by a set. So I think it was like by 2004 we had to be turned over completely to
right
digis.
Yeah, that's crazy. So let's go back to the officer staff NCO relationship. I think there's a good conversation to have there, because there's so many junior leaders, both on the enlisted side and the officer side, that listen to this, and every single one of them is mentally inside their own head asking this question, like, what can you tell me that will keep me from making a colossal mistake somewhere down the road, whether I embarrass myself or get somebody hurt or whatever it is? Everybody wants to know how to avoid the big mistake. And then I look at second lieutenants, and I was a second lieutenant once, right? And I'll tell this everybody likes to make fun of a second lieutenant. I got news for y'all. The second lieutenants make fun of themselves. They're just not doing it around you guys, right? So we all know. No second lieutenant thinks that they're, next chesty puller walking in the door. But I do think that the interesting thing about being a second lieutenant and walking into a platoon is that you have a platoon sergeant. And that platoon sergeant is a staff sergeant, which means they have been at the platoon level for what, 12, 13 years?
Probably 8 to 12 years, minimum 8 to 12, right?
Right.
More.
So they have been slogging it out in a platoon for 8 to 12 years, and you walk in the door. And that relationship is so important, because there is no way you're going to be successful as an officer unless you have a staff NCO that actually cares about you. And that relationship is so important. And I can just speak from experience, because I was fortunate enough to have my very first platoon sergeant, a guy, I'm going to use his name because I just revere him to this day, Staff Sergeant Ed Garrison, then Staff Sergeant Ed Garrison. If it wasn't for Ed Garrison, I don't think that I would have had any modicum of success as an officer immediately, or even all the way through to the day I retired. He was such an imprint on my life. He was one of my moments in leadership that I just wonder, from your perspective, how can a second lieutenant walk into any platoon? Doesn't matter. The MOS doesn't matter. How do they walk in and establish a rapport with somebody that has 8 to 12 years of experience and do it in a genuine way to where they can develop a relationship that is productive?
I would say with confidence. So the one thing that I think both require is, staff NCOs need to understand that the Marine Corps does a phenomenal job of churning out consistency out of Quantico, right? So I have served with tons of different officers. I've served with officers that maybe weren't as talented as others, right? I have only served with maybe one officer in 22 years that I could turn around and say, that guy just didn't care, right? So that's a really, really good quality metric for what comes out of TBS, right? So speaking from the infantry side, the staff NCO needs to understand this, that they're always going to come out the same, right? And this is just a fact. They're going to come out, they're going to want to PT the platoon to death. They're going to want to run every single class under the sun and train in between training and white space training. They're going to be locking on classes. They're going to be doing all sorts of things because these are the things that these guys and girls have been dreaming about doing the whole time they've been in that pipeline, right? So staff NCOs that try to fight this every time they come out, they get a reputation of being adversarial. They don't want to, every time the lieutenant asks them to do something or brings up an idea, it's no, sir, that's not the way we do this here, sir. Understand that a second lieutenant, who would respect a person that steps on deck that's supposed to be the leader and turns around and says, I don't know what I'm doing. Please, you're in charge, right? That negates the whole purpose of having a platoon commander, right? So I think it's like what I tell a lot of people. I actually was talking to a bunch of lieutenants when I was in Quantico, and one of them kind of asked the same question. I said, so if you want to feel good and you don't want to feel intimidated anymore, get your squads together, get them outside, check weapons out of the armory, and just say contact left, right? And I guarantee you are not going to see, in most cases, a situation where you're like, wow, you guys have really got it down. You're going to see a lot of work that needs to be done, right? And that's going to let you know where you fit in, right? They come out at what they lack in experience, they more than make up for in training. It's some of the best training in the world. They come out with a great foundation and doctrine. So what they get at the infantry officer course is what it takes 8 to 12 years to get as a staff NCO at infantry unit leaders course. And, IOC obviously is done better. So you get a guy that's coming into the platoon that is well-versed in tactics, TTPs, right? Up to date information. And the training that they've been through is extremely difficult, right? So understand that as the platoon sergeant. And then when you're looking at your platoon sergeant, understand this, your billets overlap, right? They're not the same. So what as far as tactics, TTPs, and what they taught you, this guy can pepper and flavor with, hey, I saw this, this is how we did it in Fallujah. You know what I mean? You throw experience at them, right? But you have to be an equal counterpart, meaning you have to give that platoon commander, and that platoon commander's got to give that staff sergeant. You've got to respect their role. You've got to respect their position, right? He's here to do this. My responsibility, sir. What are your goals? What's your vision for this platoon? I can make that happen. Flip side to it is, staff sergeant, how can you help me make that happen? Here's how I can help you, right? Here's what I think, right? And you come together. I've only had one adversarial relationship with a platoon commander my whole time. And for me, the key to success is to not be the no guy. So here's the thing, I had a platoon commander one time say, I want to take the Marines on a run to the front gate at Camp Lejeune. I haven't been on Camp Lejeune in a while. That's far, right? And I wanted to tell, I could have said, sir, no, right? Because, it's not going to be what you think, right? I said, sounds good, sir. I'll just make sure the Marines are hydrated. Told the Marines, hey, hydrate, we're running to the gate tomorrow, right? So he saw with his own eyes that half the platoon fell out, right? But who was right next to him the whole time? His platoon sergeant, right? Sir, I'm willing to do what you say, right? Here I was, we just did this crazy PT session. I was right alongside you. So maybe next time when I say, sir, that's a bad idea, you'll listen to me because I've demonstrated to you that I'm not saying no because I don't want to do something. I'm not saying no because I'm lazy. I'm saying no because it's generally a bad idea. But you got to demonstrate that first, right? Both sides have to step into the situation. The officer needs to step in with some confidence, and the staff NCO needs a little bit of humility and understanding what the roles are. For me, I've had peers of mine kind of get real pissed off because, like the lieutenant or even as a gunny, the company commander plans, he planned this attack and he didn't consult me. My thing is I've always been focused on the mechanics of war, right? So an officer gets an order that he is allowed to go sit somewhere with his right in the rain and his red lens and go look at a map and take the time he needs to plan an attack. Flip side is who's running rehearsals, who's issuing the pyro, who's issuing the smoke, who's making sure the squads are up and moving. That is the role of the staff NCO, right? So I don't have the time or the opportunity to go sit there with this guy and we're going to plan the perfect attack. That's his job. My job is with just to temper my experience and know, hey, we're going to go do a night attack. So here's what I'm doing. We're going to start practicing how to load a PLD. We're going to start talking about all the things that I know because I've done a million night attacks that are common to all, so that when he steps out ready to give his order, that platoon has done a large portion of the rehearsals. The Marines have their gear. They've been inspected. They're good to go. And now they're ready to take an order that man's had time to prepare. Flip side to it is that whatever element he sends me with, whether it's a support by fire, whether it's, the assault element, by virtue of my presence, me, the staff NCO, my experience, he can bank on the fact that that element is going to be the best damn element in the platoon by virtue of my presence being there. So that's how I kind of balance it out.
Let me flip it too, because this is really a fantastic conversation. So tell me what the perfect second lieutenant does when he walks into his platoon and starts to develop a relationship with his platoon sergeant. Like, what does that perfect second lieutenant say, do? You kind of maybe already answered it, but it's such an important thing. I want you to punctuate it by saying it again, because there is gold there.
I think if he walked in and said, I'm excited to be here. It's damn good to meet you. I'm looking forward to working with you because, I know that there's a lot that I can learn from you, right? I think that right there becomes, oh, wow. You know what I mean? Because what happens is a lot of times you have I say alpha male, but what I mean is alphas, right? So we have female alphas, right? So you have these two alphas that are kind of locked in a crab dance of like miscommunication and what you perceive to be going on, right? So, you kind of walk, you try to sniff each other out. You try to read into each other's actions, right? Lieutenant comes in and he kind of doesn't say anything, or he comes in and says like, hey, how you doing? He's very brief, and then he leaves. It's kind of like, what's that guy's problem, right? And at the same time, on the officer side, if you walk in, and you kind of just size him up, I'm sure he's like, what's his problem, right? So you have this thing that can go on and the only people that suffer is the Marines, right? So I think that if you turn around and say, just for an officer walking in and say, hey, I look forward to working with you, and I look forward to, like learning from you, right? And for the staff NCO side, it's like, hey, sir, I welcome it. You know what I mean? And I'm good, and I won't let you down, right? So that's what it comes down to,
right?
Because I've seen this too, and this is a fact, right? Good lieutenants get accepted much quicker than a staff NCO, right? So if you have a good platoon commander, those Marines love him. That becomes like the squad leaders all want to be around him. He's in there, right? The staff NCO a lot of times finds himself on the outside looking in, where he gets by, he can get circumvented, and now it just becomes the platoon commander and squad leader show, right? And the staff sergeant is relegated to just passing out chows, the chow guy and the weapons guy, counting weapons, So really, the staff NCOs need to understand that is that you got a young male or female coming in that's very athletic, very, very physically fit. They just came through a training pipeline that ensures that, right? They're motivated, because if they weren't motivated to be here, they would have never got commissioned. They would have dropped out and they would have got sent home, right? So you're dealing with someone that's gonna make you show improve, right? We can sit back and talk about it all day long, and you can kind of tell war stories, but you're gonna get this young officer that's gonna step on deck and go like, I've heard the story. Show me what you're all about, right? And you can't get mad when they ask you that, because that's the whole purpose of you being there, right?
Right.
If you get it wrong, then you're going to have a person. If you get that wrong, you're tainting that officer for the rest of their career, or you're going to, some other staff, some other staff NCO is going to have to step in and do extra work to try to recompensate for the lackluster image that you've painted of an enlisted Marine in that officer's mind. So, I think to summarize, I think that a lieutenant just needs to just step in confident and say those words. That's it. It's on us. It's the staff NCOs, right? To show them what we're about, right? Because we're the Marine Corps.
Right. How would it be received if a second lieutenant walked into that same scenario, brand new platoon sergeant, and just said, hey, Staff Sergeant Reynolds, make me the best lieutenant that I can be? Like, is that going to resonate?
Even better.
There's just some humility in that statement that's also just completely honest. And I reflect back on being an officer, a young officer, and walking into a platoon, and what you just said just made me kind of flash back. And I think, okay, when a new officer walks in, the first thing he wants to do is make a good impression, or not make a bad impression. Let's just say it's not make a bad impression, right? And what can they really do to make that first impression? Well, unless you're walking in and taking over a platoon in the middle of a field operation, you're in garrison. So what's the first thing you're going to do? You're going to PT, right? And what have you learned as an officer to do for the past 2.5 years? PT, right? PT, that's OCS, TBS, PT, and then IOC, right? PT. So you're like, okay, well, that's one thing I know how to do. I don't know, maybe a great move for a lieutenant to do would be to come in and say, hey, Staff Sergeant, what's a good way for us to start PTing together as a group with me as the new platoon commander? And then just ask and say like, hey, sir, let's start off with a 3-mile run, and then that way you can kind of gauge where we are. If nobody falls out, then we'll kind of ratchet it up from there.
Sure.
Maybe that's a good technique that people,
I've seen others come in and just, go on some crazy PT session, and it kind of lets the Marines know like, hey, that's what he's capable of. Right. So you come in, you show your capabilities. Right.
Yeah. Right.
And then the very next time it's like, hey, we're going to do it. So, now that I've established that, right. What do you,
right.
Hey, what do you want to, okay, so let's do a 3-mile, right? So like, I mean, it could go either way. It depends on, the platoon where you're at or whatever, but, I think that's what they're supposed to do, right? They're supposed to come in and be physically fit. They're supposed to come in, and a good officer challenges. A good officer keeps us honest, because you've got this young, naive person that's just like, I'm so happy to be here, right? I very rarely have ever met a second lieutenant that's checking into a battalion. It's like, I don't even want to be here, right? They're like, today's the day. Today is the day, right? Just like you would receive a new Marine, like from SOI, right? You're not going to want to make this person regret their decision to be a Marine, right? You're going to do everything you can to make this person proud of the organ as a staff NCO, because you've given your life to this. Why would you not? Why would you not want to put the best foot forward with this person, regardless of how long that they've been in the Marine Corps? You know what I mean? Whether they're a second lieutenant or a private or a general officer, you as the military professional, the guy that we were just having a conversation about this in work today. We were talking about how if a second lieutenant and a staff NCO were standing somewhere and, jackassery was going on with the Marines, right? That staff sergeant would probably get pulled aside quicker to be told, you know better.
Right.
Why are you letting this go on? Right. We know better. Right. So we need to protect and groom our officer corps, just like you would at a unit when you get brand new privates, to put the best foot forward so that we are grooming the next generation of leaders, right? The guys are going to be general officers 30 years from now, right? We are instilling in them now habits that they're going to carry with them for the rest of their time.
Right.
So that's how I look at it.
Yeah. I'll tell you that, somebody's legacy is General Berger. Right. Somebody's legacy is General Neller. Somebody's legacy is General Mattis. Like, there are platoon sergeants out there who met Second Lieutenant Mattis, Neller, Berger, right, Dunford, and that's their legacy. Those staff NCOs, that's their legacy. And the funny thing about a second lieutenant walking into a platoon and meeting his staff sergeant for the first time is you have no idea if that guy's going to become a commandant someday.
For sure.
Because he could, or she could,
for sure.
Right? Seriously. I mean, you really have no idea. And so because you don't have any idea, treat every single one of them like they could be. Maybe.
What you can guarantee is that they're going to get put in a position until the time that they leave the Marine Corps, where they're going to face decisions or be put in a position where, their actions and what they decide to do could, hurt or, impact a lot of Marines, right? So like whether it's a platoon or a division or the whole Marine Corps, right? You want to give that person everything you have to try to make sure that the best quality person is going to be, rise to the top and lead Marines. So,
right. I think making, training Marines, it's a two-way street, because we all like to make fun of the lieutenants for being lost, right? I mean, it's kind of an ongoing joke. But show me a lieutenant who seriously doesn't know how to land nav and is lost out in the woods, and I'll show you 3 or 4 NCOs who are letting that happen.
For sure.
Right. Rather than, all right, hey, listen, Lieutenant, or whatever, blah, blah, blah. And then like working with the lieutenant to get him better at it. Just nobody's great at everything. So I always joke, like in the back of my mind, I always think when I hear the joke about the lost lieutenant, I think to myself, not only is there 1 lost lieutenant, there's 3 lost NCOs too, who are letting that happen. That's not a counseling session. I'm just saying that, if you looked at it differently and said, it's my responsibility to make sure I don't have a lieutenant that gets lost out there, and I'm going to make sure that he's not and take pride in that.
There's the Hollywood image of like a hapless lieutenant, right? That's clueless. And then the wizened, salty NCO that kind of has to like drag him through combat and, keep him alive because he's nothing but a liability. That's not true. That's not true. That's not even close to true. I've never, and I've served in combat, and I use that term because combat is, with phenomenal officers that, 22, 23 years old can, handle the stress, and not only handle the stress, but sometimes like, that whole phrase, an officer and a gentleman, right? They learn how to control themselves to a degree that, some senior enlisted can't, so it's an unfair kind of stereotype, but I think it's one that kind of feeds into a lieutenant's trepidation of checking into a battalion, right? Do they all think of me that way? Like the goober that's going to get them all lost, because we key in on that, just like they key in on a sergeant major that, says, get a haircut, right? It's like, oh, that's all he, I was with the Special Forces MAGTF with India 37, and my guys had, maybe messed something up, or I think I came down to visit the trap line. It was a mess. So, I had all the squad leaders and I was kind of barking at them or whatever. And one of the Osprey pilots was talking to my company commander. He saw a guy in a frog suit, physically fit with a hindsight haircut. And he's like, so was your first sergeant like some sort of drill instructor or something? And my company commander's like, no, he's an infantry guy, but it's the image, right? It's the stereotype, right? So there's always going to be that stereotype, different things in the Marine Corps. It's just what you choose to focus on. I don't, and I worked at IULTC. What I saw was a lot of staff sergeants that are going through like infantry unit leaders course, or sergeants going through AIMC. They're trying to get that knowledge, and they're trying to go through those courses so that they could keep up with their platoon commander. Because Quantico does create a damn good product. They do. This is a fact.
That's a great way to segue into a different set of questions, a different topic. But go back to your company gunny time and tell me about some of the really awesome young corporals and sergeants that worked for you and what made them so awesome.
So I was company gunny for Fox 24. I think the thing that makes them good is that they want to train, right? They want to be the best. They want to train their guys every day, right? So the best qualities in a small unit leader as a corporal or sergeant back then when I was a company gunny, what I would look for was the guys that you could never find, right? So there used to be this old adage of like, if you want to not get assigned to a working party, get out of the barracks, because if gunny finds you, you're going to go on a working party, right? So these Marines would always be in the backyard. That's the beauty of Camp Pendleton, is that there is this wide open area that you don't have to check out with anybody. You could just walk into, and you could spend the whole day, if you want, practicing immediate action drills, patrol base operations. You could build tape houses. You could do all sorts of things to get your guys ready. And the sky's the limit. And you don't have to call range control. You don't have to do anything except walk over to the armory and draw out your weapons. So the best corporals and sergeants were the ones doing that. And more importantly, the best corporals and sergeants were the ones that were actually taking the time to like establish SOPs with their squads, right? The squad, you could look out and you could see the whole squad is set up, fairly identically with like items that are common to all. The squad, all their immediate action drills were tight. The way they did business to rooms, the way they did PT, everything. You could tell a well-drilled squad against a, one that kind of had a squad leader that wasn't really that good.
That's awesome. Yeah, the backyard it's a wonderful thing out there at Camp Pendleton. So those NCOs, did they have the latitude to get out there and train their guys? What did the lieutenant and the staff sergeant do when they were out there doing their own thing? Were they supervising? Were they sort of like half and half, sort of like go out, do your own thing, but I may come in and check in with you?
I think it's a little bit of both. So I think that, have you ever heard the analogy, like, I don't want to see how the sausage is made?
Yeah.
Right. So sometimes it's like, hey, there's certain things that are in a squad leader's purview, right? As long as the squad leader is meeting the intent of the platoon commander, the platoon sergeant, then they should be free to go about their business the way that they need to accomplish the mission. So, hey, I think it's very valid to say, hey, we're going to have white space training during this time, meaning we're not going to be in the field. I don't have anything planned. What are your plans, right? So, a good thing for an NCO to remember is this: if you don't have a plan, someone's going to make a plan for you, right? So you have a lot of guys that are like, oh, this is bullshit. They're always telling me what to do. It's like, well, what did you have? Oh, we weren't doing anything, right? So if you're going to screw around and play Xbox in the barracks, then you better, yeah, the lieutenant's going to come around, platoon sergeant's going to come around and is going to tell you what you're going to do, right? So the best guys always were forward thinking to say, hey, sir, between this time and this time, I'd love to take the boys in the backyard and go over, immediate action drills, or we'd like to go over patrolling, right? No lieutenant says, no, sergeant, that's a bad idea, right? I think a lot of times what they turn around and say, that's great. I'd love to come out and maybe give a class or help you, sounds good, sir. And the lieutenant would come out and watch, add some things, and that's perfectly fine. Hey, sir, what do you got? It's his platoon, right? Your squad, but his platoon, right? So that was the best case scenario. So I think it's a mix, right? So the lieutenant needs to give them that latitude, provide them the time to work one-on-one with their squad, right? Free of any sort of intrusion or obstruction or what have you, right? But also the squad leader needs to understand that, you're going to have your window for that. So have a plan, right? And then there's going to be platoon time, right? And then there's going to be company time. And, one of the things that I used to do was I used to keep a 3x5 card in my pocket, right? Because I realized I will never get the time that I need, all the time I need in one shot to go work on all the things that I want. But I am going to get hour increments here and there, right? While I'm waiting for trucks, or, we don't got anything going on between this time and this time in the rear. And I'm going to pull out that 3x5 card. And these are going to be all of the things that I know I need to work on with my squad, right? So like case in point, lieutenant would say like, hey, Reynolds, we're going to have some downtime. Or the platoon sergeant would say, hey, we don't got anything going on between this time and this time. I'd pull it out and go, I'm going to go do ambushes with my guys. Sounds good. What are you guys doing? The other squadrons, what are you guys going to do? I think we're going to do that too. Okay, great. Right. I always had a plan, because when you have a plan, the people that get pissed off are the people that don't have a plan. Why are you being told what to do all the time? It's probably because you don't have a plan. And, people feel like they need to supervise you. So.
Yeah. So I know senior leaders, are generally pretty humble about themselves, but I'm wondering if you could tell me if you remember like the very first time that you were really proud of yourself as a leader.
Yeah. So I was a machine gunner. I got out of the Marine Corps and came back in. And when we went back for the second go round in Iraq, keeping a dedicated weapons platoon was unnecessary. So what they did was they took me, and I went from being a machine gunner to a rifle squad leader, right? Which was like pretty scary to me, because I had never led a patrol in my life. I knew machine guns, but I didn't know a whole lot about being a rifle squad leader. And the rifle squad leaders that I did know, that I really respected, like really knew their craft. So there was like a lot of anxiety on my part. So I spent a lot of time talking to everybody that I knew that I respected that were 0311s. And I spent a lot of time reading books. I grabbed up every unit SOP I could to kind of try to give myself a crash course in squad leading before we went to Fallujah. And I sat down with my Marines and I was like, listen, we're going to go through some rehearsals, right? The rehearsals were less for them and more for me to kind of look at, I only knew what contact left looked like from behind a machine gun, right? I didn't know what contact left looked like in relation to everybody else, right? Or, all these things. So we worked through all of this together. And what ended up happening was I ended up getting an incredibly tight squad for a couple of reasons. Because one is that everybody had a say-so kind of in how we established these SOPs. But the thing at the start was, once we established them, right, this is how we do business. And we established that for everything, from the way we prep for patrol, the way we staged our gear, the way we did everything, and we were always together. So got to the point where mid-deployment, they said the regimental commander wants to go on a patrol with one of the squads that's currently inside the city of Fallujah. So it was Echo Company and Fox Company. And the regimental commander was Colonel Berger for 8th Marines. So our battalion sent out the battalion operations officer to literally patrol with every squad in the battalion to kind of get a sense of like, okay, who do we want to show as a representative of second Battalion, 6th Marines, small unit, leadership, squad leader, right? And he came out with us. He was going through all the squads. I mean, this guy, he was out. I think he was out for like 2 weeks, just tacking on to patrols and going out and making notes or whatever. My squad was selected to take Colonel Berger out on patrol. And he came with us and he patrolled the whole way from the North Fallujah, the train station, all the way through the market, everything. And I mean, it was like tier 1 IED sites. So we were taking sniper attacks all the time. He came with us on patrol, and I was really proud of the fact that my squad was selected to take the regimental commander out for patrol. I mean, that's the first time, obviously, coming up, seeing my guys get meritoriously promoted, awards, or see them go on and do great things in their career. I can keep track of them now on social media, or maybe they'll send me a message. All those things make me feel great. But that was the first time that I was like, wow, maybe I'm not, maybe I'm all right, so that was it.
How did then Colonel Berger blend in with the squad? I mean, just, can you paint that picture for me? Like, and how tempted were you to say like, hey, you got to hump this, this 240 over here, Colonel Berger,
No. I was too nervous. I was praying that we didn't take contact. I was praying that, everything was okay. And there was aside from the initial anxiety of having a full-board colonel come on patrol with me, there was none after that. He crossed, he was like another rifleman in the patrol. And then, he covered danger areas. He did everything that the rest of the Marines did. He even, I think he made it a point to show up and observe our immediate action drills so that he knew what was going on in the event that we took contact. So it wasn't really, I say this all the time because I think people think that like leadership kind of gets to a position where they're cozy and comfy somewhere. But I felt like there was that he did not have to go on patrol with us. And he did. And not only did he show up for patrol, it wasn't a window patrol. That man showed up early to observe rehearsals, to participate in rehearsals, because, I think it goes back to that first thing is that, he was a Marine leader. That's what his Marines do. And he was out there that day to share the risk with his guys. It's like an internal clock, right? Like a good leader says, I haven't been on patrol for a while. The things that a colonel's responsible for, there's every excuse in the world to never go on patrol, really. But there's something inside really good leaders to say, I got to go. There's something, I got to go share the risk. It's my turn to share the risk with the guys or the Marines. And that's what he did. So aside from that initial anxiety at the beginning, it was fine. And then we crossed over Route Michigan through the market, went firm and he came up, shook my hand and said, I got to go. Great patrol. They had an escort an escort showed up, we waited, we pulled security, the gun trucks pulled up, he jumped in, and went to somewhere else in the AO. But I felt a little, obviously you don't want to look bad, but I was pretty confident in my guys then.
That's a great story. I'm glad you shared that with us. It's interesting because I think there's a fine line between having people think that, the colonel's coming out on this patrol, is he looking for his combat action ribbon or,
right.
And I know that people think that, right? But then I put myself into General Berger's mind and I think the same thing you just said, which was, hey, I feel a responsibility to go out and share the risk with the men and women that I'm leading. And if I don't do that, what kind of leader am I? And there's this pull between those two things that's very difficult. And I think, knowing every single one of my officer friends, I don't have a single officer friend that would have ever walked out on that patrol because they were trying to get a combat action ribbon. They would have been out on that patrol because they wanted to share the risk with the men and women that they were leading. And I think that takes a lot of guts. And I'm glad to hear that story. I'm glad he got to go out with you. And I'm glad that was your takeaway from that too. That's a really impressive story. And I like hearing those kind of stories. That's great. So another question for you. There's this old saying, there, but for the grace of God, walk I. And I'm kind of wondering if you ever had a moment in your career, and if you had a couple, I'd prefer to hear one from combat, where you said to yourself, thank God that wasn't me, and turn that into a formative experience that you were able to apply in the future to some sort of leadership challenge.
I would say that, again, on a combat deployment, my squad was the react. We were in the train station in North Fallujah, and I had just got done shaving. We just heard an incredible explosion, and then we just gunfire. The company, the guy on radio watch came running out because we used to stage react gear by the trucks, and the Marines, we would sit out there like on strip alert, so he's like, react. So, it was well drilled. My Marines knew. They jumped in the trucks, by fire team, and the trucks got loaded up, and I would go into the COC and I would get a brief from my company commander. He basically said that a squad had been ambushed. So we go and, gave us a location. So we go out there and we turn the corner, and, the Marines are firing down the street, and they had taken the first room in a house. So when we got there, we put up alongside the house, and the Marines that weren't, engaged in the firefight start bringing out Marines, right? And you could tell from the first two that they were clearly, they were killed in action. And then the second one had been shot in the chest, and he was fighting for his life. So basically, to make a long story short, is we brought those casualties back to Camp Fallujah, and for the one guy who was a corpsman, he needed blood, right? So I was his blood type. So they hooked me up, and I was given blood. And then by that point, my squad got called back. So once they had gotten my blood, the two other Marines were killed in action, and the chief medical officer came out and said, like, you're the senior Marine here. You need to identify these personnel. So, they brought me back into a back room one by one, and I had to identify the Marines that were killed in action and say, yes, that's Lance Corporal so and so. Yes, that's getting back and seeing that squad leader, the guy that had lost Marines and like what that had done to him. Right. He did everything right that day. So those Marines weren't lost by any sort of negligence on his part whatsoever. But seeing that and seeing what he was experiencing, seeing what he was going through made it that much more serious for me, saying like, I don't, like we're going to take this as we are never going to let our guards down. I don't want to live with this burden. I don't want this to happen to me. I don't want to go through this experience if there's anything that I can do about it. So, I mean, I was already attacking my responsibilities pretty seriously. But from that point forward, I made sure that I never took the easy way because it was more comfortable or made any sort of decisions based on I'm tired or whatever, because that right there was a clear example of what we stand to lose, right? What can happen at any given moment in combat. So the severity of things just really hit me that day. Up to that point, we sustained casualties, but they were wounded, nothing really too traumatic. So war was pretty much, you would actually say, like, I hope we get into a firefight today. Guys would say stuff like that, and then after that, it was like punched in the face by reality of like, this is the end result of combat, right? So you need to make sure that every time you step outside the wire, your chin strap is buttoned tight and you are ready to go. Your head is on the swivel, no excuses, no bad days, And because of a result of that, I hadn't watched the Super Bowl in probably close to 8 years. Guys would say, like, how do you not know anything about the NFL from like 2005 to 2012? It's like, because I was deployed and guys would stay up late and watch the Super Bowl. And like, I'm going to sleep. I got a patrol tomorrow. Like, I am going to make sure that I am ready to go at all times. And that's what that event taught me.
I think there's something very valuable to take away from that for anybody listening, because I like to ask the question, what can you recall a singular moment where you really fully realize the gravity of your influence or your responsibility? It sounds like that would have been the answer if I had asked you a question that way. And what you said was, never at that moment you realized, I'm never going to take the easy way out. I'm always going to make sure that we are, chin straps are buttoned. And I think that there is a natural, when you're in garrison and in training, to try to take the easy way out. I think that can infect leaders at all levels. Tired, it's just training. But when you experience the gravity of the situation like you did, I think it paints it in a totally different picture. And I just want to encourage, emerging leaders who are listening to this to rewind those last 5 minutes and listen to it again, because it's probably some of the most instructive 3 to 5 minutes that I've ever heard on this podcast about the gravity of the situation that you're in charge of, the gravity of your command or influence or responsibility when it results in something like that. And when you see it, I think it's life altering. And to be able to hear somebody say that and the importance of it, I think is gold. Again, I think probably one of the most poignant statements ever made on this podcast. Thanks for sharing that with me. Going back to your company gunny days, or I'll even say your first sergeant days. I asked you the question about when you were a company gunny, tell me about some of the great NCOs that you had. Go back to your company gunny days or your first sergeant days, your choice, and tell me about what the really successful officers look like. It could be platoon commanders or company commander, your choice. And maybe tell us about those people.
It was like a gift from God. I got selected for first sergeant, and I got sent to India Company 37, and the company commander there was a guy by the name of Major Nick Morales. And he believed in small unit discipline, right? So there's a thing, right? People misconstrue discipline to mean punishment. This guy had a very disciplined approach to the way he did things. His Bible was the pub rifle company operations. He was the most consistent man that I'd ever seen. And what he did do was, there's a tendency, I think, and I talk about this a lot, right, is that I think officers, like, so you were talking earlier on about like, how can a lieutenant, what should they do on the first day? Well, what they shouldn't do is compromise themselves to the Marines. So I think a lot of times when you see like an officer fail is if he tries to become too much one of the boys, right? So, they don't understand that they have an enlisted Marine, especially a junior enlisted Marine, is going to get his ass handed to him much quicker than an officer would, in some cases for just little things like, running around like with a crappy uniform or sunglasses on top of the head, like little things that's going to get a young Marine yoked up by the first sergeant, right? And then, the junior officers kind of flaunt, right, because they're trying to be cool. Major Morales was so disciplined that he held his officers to a standard where it was very much he was observing, he was coaching, he was mentoring, and he wasn't cutting any corners to make these guys feel good. So it was great. He would give company orders, and he would call all the lieutenants by their call sign. I never once heard him call the lieutenants by their last name. So it'd be like, Lieutenant McNeil, that was India 2. So it would be India 2, India 2. I thought it was kind of cool because he was always reinforcing what their role is, what their job is every day. They are the platoon commander for India 2nd Platoon, right? So when we would give company orders, he would sit there with them and make them rehearse how they were going to speak. Like rehearse your order, not just the tactics behind the order, but your order's delivery. And he was just reaffirming to these guys that every time they stood in front of Marines, every time they interacted with Marines, every time they did anything in uniform, they need to be a representative of a competent and professional Marine officer. And he had these rules. This was his whole culture that he had created in that company to where all of these guys followed suit. They were the ones that, a big thing after your first deployment is like what billet a lieutenant gets, right? Weapons company. So all of these guys were either weapons platoon commanders, which is a big deal, or company executive officers, because he had taught them from the get-go what right looked like and how to act as a junior officer in a ground combat unit. And the best part was, while he was doing that with the officers, I was doing that with the enlisted. And I think I was debating in my head when you were asking me what the proudest moment was when I was a leader. But, the second most proudest moment was when the 1st Marine Division CG came out and watched us do our Morgan's Well attack. He pulled the Marines aside and said, "This is the most proficient and disciplined rifle company right now in the division." He's like, "And I've seen all of them." He's like, "You guys are great." And I was like, wow, there's nothing better than to be told that you are the most disciplined and proficient rifle company. He had this thing where we didn't blow any, we were just consistent. Every attack was consistent. There was no attacks or no thing that we did where the evaluator would go, "Oh my God, this is the greatest thing we ever saw." And there was never one where they were like, "You guys really suck." It was always, "Hey, good job, India. A couple things to work on, but overall, great job." He was the most consistent company commander I had ever seen in my life. And he taught his junior officers to never compromise yourselves in front of the junior Marines because they're always watching you, right? He was a former platoon commander in Sangin. So all the stories that I'm telling you about losing lives was driven home to him as a platoon commander. So he was the guy that they would expend all of their energy to make sure they got it right the first time, because Captain Morales at the time, knew what was at risk, right? Your wake-up call to get it together is not going to be the death of a Marine, right? This is what we stand to lose. So every single day, we're going to take training, our PT, the way we conduct ourselves, even in garrison, as an opportunity to train and get ready for what could come next. And, that's what I thought was like the best example for junior officers.
That's awesome. Did he stay in? Is he still in?
Oh, he's still in. Yeah, he's still running around. He's actually on recruiting duty out here with us.
Oh, is he? Okay, great.
Yep.
Okay. So there's a good segue for you. So tell me about some of the things that you learned in all of your time in the infantry community, sustained combat, right? Horrible situations that you witnessed. And now you're on recruiting duty. So what were some of the things that you learned early on in your career that have become instrumental to you now in a completely different world of recruiting, right? Because for listeners that don't understand what that means is, Sergeant Major Reynolds is leading recruiting, help me out if I get this wrong, leading recruiting stations who are out there selling the Marine Corps and getting people to join. That's a totally different leadership. How were some of the things that you learned early on in your career? How have they become instrumental to what you're doing now?
Well, there's a couple. So the first thing would be humility, right? So, when I was telling you about how First Sergeant Zickafoos kind of humbled himself to participate in a patrol, and or when I was telling you about picking up a squad coming over from a machine gun section, and kind of just figuring it out, like, "Hey guys, help me understand this." So coming out on recruiting duty, I have no idea my first year. I had no idea what I was even looking at. They use acronyms, and it's an environment wholly unlike what you would find in the operating forces. So unless you were a previous recruiter, which I wasn't, you are stepping into this environment with a steep, steep learning curve. So to be able to turn around and say, like, listen, I know nothing about what you guys are talking about, and being pulled aside and trained and asking questions from the career recruiters out here, I think that does a good job of building a little bit of rapport, right? So it's good to have a senior leader that steps in and says, like, no, I have no idea what you're talking about. Please explain to me. And they do, and they love it. They have no problem spending all the time to help me understand what they're talking about. The other part is recruiting is extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult, right? These recruiters have a tough job. They get told no a lot. One of the things that has helped me, and what combat has taught me, is I established a baseline, right? So the baseline that's established in my head is the absolute worst possible scenario that I've experienced as a Marine, which is, like I've said to you before, was, that instance where I'm identifying Marines that are killed in action, at a surgical unit in Fallujah. So that's my baseline. So as long as things don't get worse than that, I can operate. I'm fine, right? So I'm able to every day kind of not get demotivated and not, kind of get apathetic towards my duties, or, people, there's that thing where people say, like, oh, recruiting's not, recruiting sucks and stuff like that. I turn around and say, hey, any day that I'm not, experiencing, what I experienced in Fallujah is a good day, right? So it keeps my mindset positive so that I don't get stuck in myself or get, chewed up by this like difficult environment. And then the last thing is like resiliency, right? Resiliency. I've learned so many times over my career, over and over and over again, that when things get bad, you have to just put your head down and continue to march, continue to push, right? So there's a ton of challenging times on recruiting duty. There's tons of challenging days. There's months where, it's really, really difficult. There's months where it's really, really, rewarding. The bottom line is this, to be resilient, to take what the world throws at you, to take what the Marine Corps throws at you, to take what the mission throws at you and not fold and know that it's going to get better. You just got to keep moving forward. It's something that I learned in combat that I continue to carry with me here. And, my next duty assignment, if there is one. So, those are the three things I think that have helped me kind of adapt to this environment. It's also a respect too of the recruiters, what they go through each and every day. It's very, very difficult. I don't think people can quite understand the fact that you'll take a Marine from any single MOS and, effectively he comes out as a representative of the United States Marine Corps, and he's selling the United States Marine Corps and all of its benefits to the local population, and, he or she's got to overcome disinterest. What if the sting of being told no all the time, you know what I mean? And keep pushing to find that one qualified individual that's going to turn around and say, yeah, I think I want to be a Marine. And there's a lot of no's that come with that final yes. And these guys and girls have to deal with this every single day. Clear, tangible mission, and honestly, clear, tangible results if they fail to meet that mission, right? That's the kind of the horror stories of recruiting duty, is that, you got to write your contracts or else, this, that, and whatever. So they feel the pressure, right? So they're just like riflemen in the field, I try not to make it any worse for them. I try to support them. I try to respect what they're doing, right? And take their experiences and what each day must feel like for them into account every time I interact with them, just like I would in the fleet with a rifleman, on a rooftop somewhere in downtown Fallujah. You don't know what you got to take some respect for what they're going through each day.
Yeah, I think I never served on recruiting duty, so I can't relate to it that much, but I can relate a little bit to it just because of my civilian world, right? And so one of the things I think makes recruiting really hard, and I'm interested about this from a leadership perspective, is that if I was a infantry company commander and I went out to the field and I did some sort of training exercise, there's really no way to truly measure that. Yeah, it was
Right.
good attack. It was bad. We could have done this better. Would have really liked to have seen us improve here. Contact left with third squad wasn't all that great. I mean, right? You can assess things,
Right.
but you really can't measure them.
Right.
You get on recruiting duty, it's measurement, right? It is cold, hard, factual data. You either did or did not recruit somebody and make your mission to come in.
Mm-hmm.
How have you been able to take some of your past and as a senior enlisted leader in recruiting for the very first time, and you said, you really didn't know what you were doing. How are you counseling and mentoring those Marines who are junior to you and look up to you for your leadership, given such a difference in upbringing through the Marine Corps with being on recruiting for the very first time?
I think the first thing that I try to do is be self-aware, right? So, just the other day, I had an interaction with a guy. His tact sucked. I was like, then you can leave. I don't got anything to say to you. Get out of my office, right? And like 30 seconds went by, and I brought him back in, right? Because the first thing that you need to understand, you need to be self-aware of the fact that you can absolutely, if you want to, go ahead and dress a Marine down. You can, go ahead and fly off the handle and start yelling and screaming and causing all sorts of chaos. But understand what happens next, right? If I'm trying to get the best performance out of this individual, right? Try to make them successful, right? To try to make them healthy and happy as much as I can, to want to go out there and put their best foot forward. I'm not going to get that by, chewing a Marine's ass and then sending them back out on the street, right? So, it's that kind of sucks. So I kicked him out of the office, but I pulled him back in and I said, I want to apologize for jumping down your throat. I can understand the stress that you're under, and I can understand, how it must feel to be brought in my office to be talked to about the things that we're talking about. To tell you the truth, I probably would have answered the questions the same way you just did, because you're passionate, you're invested in the mission, and you're hearing things you don't like right now. So I'm aware of that. I apologize. I see where you're coming from. I just need you to get back out there and continue to produce and continue to do the right thing. And I think that in and of itself is is to kind of try to sympathize. You can not sympathize, empathize with what they're doing and what they're going through. And at the same time, you can turn around and say, I hear you. It's never an excuse to not do your job. I recognize all of the conditions that you're facing right now. I recognize that this is very difficult. How can I help you be successful? Maybe my whole social media page was set up so that I could talk to the recruiters about how to use social media, right? It was my wife's idea to tell like the stories and stuff like that. I had initially set up an Instagram page and was taking pictures of pool functions and stuff like that. And my wife was like, if you do this, maybe you should talk about your career or whatever to entice interest in the Marine Corps, right? I wanted to give them something where I could turn around and say, hey, here's how to work a social media, right? Here's how this works. And I gave them a class on it and all these things so that I can, every time I try to interact with them, I try to give them something, right? I may not give them the answer, but maybe I'm giving them a tool. Maybe I'm giving them a reason to want to push hard for the rest of the day and show up with their game face on the next day. That's it. Because at the end of the day, it's going to be them out on the street doing their job or trying to accomplish the mission.
You brought up the social media page. I'll just take this opportunity to talk about it again. You have such a fantastic social media page. I read every single word that you write on Instagram. I open up every single comment, every single, whatever you call it, like post, like the narrative that you write. And you have just written some fantastic stuff. And if there are emerging leaders in any service, even civilian, listening to this, I'll really encourage you to go find the Instagram page. I'll put the link to it below. It's at Norseman9 underscore 9, Norseman9 underscore 9. Ugh, I'll get that right. It'll be in the description notes. Really go read some of that. It's inspiring. And here's the thing that I love about it too. Social media 5-6 years ago is kind of poo-pooed by everybody. People would act like they didn't even know what it was, and sort of in a self-deprecating way. And, I would never use that face page thing, and pretend like they didn't really know what it was about. And then I've seen people recently just embrace it as a leadership tool. And I am firmly convinced that social media employed by military leaders can be such a tool for good. And that's one of the passion projects. That's one of the things I'm really passionate about with this project is every leader has, I think, a moral responsibility to memorialize their experiences so they can be used as a learning resource for future leaders. And so you are memorializing your experiences for others to use in real time, and in a way that if you just stood in front of a formation and said whatever it is that you post on social media, X people would hear it. Some finite number of people would hear it. When you put it out there on digital media, everybody can read it. So your sphere of influence as a leader has just expanded so much. It's really incredible. And I just think that I'm not a Comstrat officer. I never was. I worked in the Division of Public Affairs for a hot second before I retired. But I will tell you that I think the future of the Comstrat MOS resides with the people who are captains right now, not the colonels, because they really understand this information as a weapon. And you have embraced it as a leadership tool with such phenomenal success. I really admire it. So sorry, that was a quick commercial and a pat on the back. Keep it up, because I just love your stuff, and that's why you're on the podcast today. I met you on Instagram and
Yeah, thank
loved
you.
the stuff and said this guy's got a lot to say. So, but that's really interesting, because one of the things that's got to be difficult about recruiting and leading in recruiting is that those recruiters out there, they can control their activity all day long, make this many phone calls, go see this many people, do this sort of commute, right? But what they can't control is somebody actually saying yes. All that is completely out of their control, yet they're held accountable for it. And that is that is a leadership function. I'm imagining, I want you to agree or disagree with this. That is a lot more akin to being the coach of a football team and trying to get your athletes to perform at their very best in the position that they're supposed to be playing, versus being a leader in an infantry company is totally different.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this the other day walking into work, because I'm still trying to figure out the right balance here, right? Because this is difficult, extremely difficult. And for me, the thing that I've relied on all the way up until I've been on recruiting is leadership, right? So like I think that I was thinking about this in my head the other day, right? We talk about tactical, operational, and strategic. And then I was thinking about leadership, coaching, and management, right? So you have leadership, which is like, that's what I could do, all the way up until I was a sergeant major, right? On recruiting. I could inspire people by getting down with them and, basically saying, follow me, or do it this way, or I'll do it with you, right? So that's that type of leadership where it's like, I'm going to be out front. I'll show you, right? Management is kind of like when you're so high up that you have very limited interaction with Marines, and you're kind of just, managing numbers on a paper, and this, we're short this many staff sergeants and stuff like that. Yeah, you're right. I'm at the coaching level right now. It's where I have 4 states. I can't get out there and get in a car with a recruiter and say, I'll show you how to go get someone to say yes, right? So you're coaching them to try to help them through the no's, help them through the adversity, help them through the frustration, keep them positive, make them feel supported, and try to take care of them so that they have enough gas in the tank or enough water in the well to want to wake up every day and put their best foot forward. So, and it's a very difficult balance to walk or to maintain. For me, I tell all of them, right? My goal for you is to leave this duty with a successful tour, your family intact, and you're relevant in your MOS field, ready to go back and assume like the next leadership position, right? So I will do everything humanly possible to try to make sure that this recruiting duty is not where it ends for you, right? That you don't give up in frustration and your career doesn't end up in adversity. What can I do for you, right? Because you're very much a servant out here, right? You're servant leadership. I don't get to sit back with like a canteen cup full of coffee dictating terms to the Marines out in the field, right? It's just not that way. All independent stations, 4 states. I would be naive to think that I sit somewhere and say, do it this way, and that's the way it's going to be. I have to get out. I have to go spend time with these recruiters. I have to visit stations. But the flip side to it is I got to make my visits count. I can't spend all day in there wasting productive time for them while they're entertaining the sergeant major. So I get in, I get out, and I move on to the next station. With that being said, when a Marine calls and says, like, can I talk to you? I will drive to Fargo, North Dakota to go sit in an office with a guy for him to pour his heart out or speak about his frustrations or whatever. And I'll be there overnight because that's what it takes to keep the Marines successful. That's what it takes to keep the Marines wanting to do their job. I mean, I have no problem showing that type of support.
Yeah, it's a great answer. And I agree. Recruiting must be so hard. My hat's off to every single one of them that are out there in those duty stations, getting it done every single day for the Marine Corps. I mean, it's an easy product to sell, but it's also not. So I think it should be an easy product to sell because I love the Marine Corps, right? But it's tough. And you're also dealing with parents too. Jeez,
It's a highly politicized world right now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So
kind of shifting gears one last time as we wrap up with a couple last questions here, but I want to ask you some questions about, knowing that there's a time and a place for the issuance of a direct order, right? That must be immediately followed. A combat situation comes to mind as an example. Is it your opinion that we should be setting the conditions to encourage more collaboration between junior levels of leadership in a unit? One that sets the climate of providing useful feedback instead of that because I said so that you just said in the recruiting thing with your canteen cup and you just get to dictate orders. Is there some benefit to creating some collaboration
for sure
rather than just issuing orders? Talk to me about your opinion on that.
So my thing is I've always been receptive to, except when I was a corporal, right? But as I started to get older in the Marine Corps, I've always opened the floor up to suggestions, right? So there is a time for that, okay? Marines need to understand what that time is. And for a leader, when you get the initial warning order, or you start to catch wind that you're about to go do something, that's absolutely time to pull in, your subordinates and say, hey, I get a sense that we're about to go do this, or here's what we're going to get tasked to go do. Here's what I'm thinking. Squad leaders, team leaders, what do you guys think, right? The floor is open to suggestions. You entertain suggestions, right? Hey, I like that. Yeah, that sounds good. That's a window of time that exists in and of itself. And once that window closes, i.e., the floor is now closed to suggestions, now it's time to march. I think leaders get this wrong where they operate under a very democratic, every single, hey, we're going to go do this. Okay, now this happens. Okay, stop. Let's get together for the Lance Corporal Democratic Convention, right? And start talking about what to do next. No. That all starts prior to the mission when we're in our planning phase, right? The floor is open to suggestions. I'll hear all suggestions. I'll entertain suggestions from identified leaders, right? I don't entertain suggestions from the peanut gallery, but people hold billets for a reason. Once that's done, then, okay, we slap the table and we say, here's what we're doing. Good. We move on. I remember saying this when I was at CQB school. We sat in a room, we were planning on how we were going to do something. And as we went to go do it, one of the guys like, yeah, see, I disagree. Hey, the floor has been closed. The good idea time is now over. We are in the execution phase, right? So once you move into the execution phase, then all suggestions and all good ideas have to stop and you have to execute, right? So I think where leaders get it wrong, and I think junior Marines get it wrong, is there's a time and a place for that, right? So if you're a leader in charge in the planning phase, yes, absolutely. Hey, what are your thoughts? Hey, here's what we're going to go do. And for the junior Marines, don't state problems, state a problem and a solution, right? Then the floor is closed. You can't sit there forever. Once the floor is closed, we execute, right? And, if there's a problem, write it down, cover it in the AAR, and we'll discuss it after. But as of right now, we're marching.
That's a great answer. I agree with you. I think, collaboration, I think I've learned this more just on the civilian side than I did in the Marine side, but the collaboration is such a key, and facilitating that and making room for it when appropriate is I think a great tool for any leader to use. Kind of wrapping up with one last question here. And this may sound like a really strange question to ask a sergeant major, so give me some latitude here. Do you think it's important to care if your Marines like you?
I think I would be naive. It's ridiculous when people say I'm not here to make friends. Every person wants to be liked. Okay, that's just human nature, right? So if you legitimately say I don't care what anybody thinks about me, that's wrong. That's not true, right? I absolutely care what people think of me, right? Because I'm giving my heart and soul to this organization, right? I would hate to give my heart and soul to this organization and think that, I'm doing right by my Marines, only to walk away and hear or come across chatter where they're like, that guy's an asshole, right? You're like, oh, that hurts, that stings. So I think that understanding that, yes, you do want to be liked, but here's the question. What do you want to be liked for? So there's an opportunity to teach your Marines where they'll remember you forever and they'll like you forever and respect you forever because you got them to do the things that they didn't want to do because it was the right thing to do, right? So initially, you probably won't be the most popular guy around. They're going to have to see the fruits of their labor with their own eyes, right? Where people kind of get lost in the mix is where they try to do both. That you can't, your primary focus in life, if it's to be liked, you're never going to get anything done. And everything's going to be kind of like chaotic and confusing. So people that try to jump back and forth, if you show up to work every day with the right mindset, you show up to work every day, committed to doing the right thing, training your people, making sure the missions get accomplished. And every time you make a decision with the mission and the Marines in mind. They may not like every decision, but they're going to see the end results of it and they'll start to respect you, right? And with that respect, they will turn around, and it may take time. It's like wine, right? I have guys now that probably would run the other way when they saw me when we were together, now turn around 4, 5, 6, 7, 10, 20 years later and say, like, hey, I want to thank you for X, Y, and Z that you did. I didn't agree with it then, but now I see why. So that in and of itself, that legacy, that thing that you're going to leave with them is much more important, right, than being liked initially or making sure every decision that you make is popular. But yeah, guys, you're going to face that dilemma. You're going to feel that stomach churning thing about like, oh, I know they're probably, mother effing me in the barracks right now because I just told them X, Y, and Z, but I know it's the right thing to do. And here's the reason why. And we're going to do it this way because that's the best way for these guys or for these gals, for these Marines, right? So you need to keep that in mind.
That's a great wrap-up question there. And I know Daniel will be very happy that you suppressed the F-bomb there. So hats off to you, because I know you said that was one of your goals, to make her proud about your restrained language on the podcast. So well
Sure.
done. And you did a great job there. So I'll just take a quick minute to kind of recap some of the things that we've been talking about for the past almost 2 hours. Sergeant Major Don Reynolds, I mean, started off as a self-proclaimed troublemaker in high school with a UA on his very first Liberty weekend in Lima 3-2. But you went on to talk about how the staff NCOs of Lehman 3-2 really became the crop of men that became how you measured yourself even today as a sergeant major. And you said that one of the things that the staff NCOs said to you back then was, you don't get to pick when you apply your efforts. And I just thought that was such a great quote. I'm going to remember that. You went on to talk about how you had a first sergeant in Fallujah that insisted on coming out and observing combat orders, and he would come out and watch you, and then when you went in to say, hey, I'm ready for my order, and he said, I don't need to see it anymore, that's when you knew you were good to go. We spent some more time talking about when you got in trouble for the UA and how you went from being a Marine and said, I hope they kick me out of the Marine Corps, to, now becoming a sergeant major, which I think is interesting, because there has not been a single guest on this podcast that hasn't shared a story about how they got in trouble at some point in their career. And I just think that we didn't really talk about this, but there is always an avenue for redemption in the Marine Corps. You may not think so, but I've got, 13 episodes of people who talk about their redemptions in the Marine Corps. And you talked about how some of the NCOs were just nice to you and treated you well, even though you had a nickname. I didn't write it down. UA something.
UA piece of shit.
UA piece of shit. Okay. Right. And then you said to yourself at one point, you said, I'm sick of being in trouble, so I want to fulfill my obligation to the Marine Corps. And then that introduced the next stage of your leadership life when you were introduced to what you phrase as the nasty corporal. And you quickly discovered that the best revenge was to basically outwork him. And you got to a point where you'd pass him on a hike and say, "Hoorah, corporal," which led up to a meritorious corporal promotion in Okinawa. And you said to yourself, geez, now I'm the same rank as that corporal. And you went on to just basically outwork and you used him as a gauge. You didn't say it this way, but you used him as a gauge to make sure that you were always better than that. And in fact, you had done such a great job over in Okinawa that your platoon commander wrote your parents a letter, which we talked about for a while. And then we got on to talking about 9/11, and I asked you, I said, okay, great. Now you're corporal and 9/11 happens. What was that like when the command, and you started telling the story about the now famous to me, Dave Parker, and how it was, we joked around about his appearance a little bit and hand sewing his name tapes on. I thought that was pretty funny because I can close my eyes and see that. And how he was the total opposite of all the aggressive staff NCOs. He never yelled, he never screamed, but he was the guy that had the most combat experience. And then when you went over to OIF, you ended up, with a platoon sergeant that was a POS, we'll call it. And he degraded over time, and he told this great story about how there was mortar fire, and he told you to go get his cigarettes. That was when you just realized, like, what in the hell's going on? And then it degraded all the way to when Lieutenant was given a frag order, the gunny just picked up that map and threw that hand laminated map. And that's when Task Force Dave Parker was created. And that staff sergeant that you were telling the stories about with all the combat experience just very calmly and coolly came in and took over not only 3rd Platoon, but Weapons Platoon, and fostered a great relationship between the staff NCOs and the officers in that task force, we'll call it. And that was a great story. It obviously imprinted on you because we went on to talk about officer relationships with staff NCOs and how you made the point that TBS really puts out a pretty quality product. But that quality product that comes out, they're all very homogenous. Lieutenants will always come out the same from Quantico is how you said it. And they come out, they're on fire, and that staff NCOs, platoon sergeants need to understand that that's the product that Quantico is putting out. And you made this great comment that if a lieutenant really wants to know how good his platoon is, drag him out to the armory, have him draw weapons, and just say contact left, and you'll basically see all the work that needs to be done in your platoon. I thought that was really great. Probably a lot of truth in that jest. You made the point that billets, lieutenants and platoon sergeants, their billets overlap, but they're not exactly the same. And you said one of the greatest things that a platoon sergeant could say to a new officer coming in is, what is your vision for this platoon? and don't be the no guy as the staff NCO. And then we turned around and we started talking about, okay, what would be a great way for a lieutenant to come in and take over a platoon? And basically it was to ask that staff NCO to help them understand and create a training plan that was obtainable, and that you need to understand that when a staff NCO tells you no, that there's probably a reason for it. And he told the story about, if you wanted to go out and run to the gate, that you'd be right there with the lieutenant, but then you'd be able to come back and say, hey, see, I told you no for a reason. And I thought that was a really great insight into leadership and officer staff NCO relationships. I then went on to tell me about the time when you were company gunny, and you brought up the time with Fox 24 and the NCOs out there. What made great NCOs was that they were the ones that wanted to go out and train their guys. We talked about going out in the backyard. And if you wanted to find the best NCOs, they were the ones that were never around because they were out in the backyard training, and they were out establishing OPs with their teams and their squad leaders. We then moved into where I asked you a question about, tell me about a time you were proud of yourself as a leader. And you told me that when you came back in from having some broken time, that you were made a rifle squad leader and not a machine gun squad leader. And that was new for you. So you immersed yourself in books, and you actually used drilling rehearsals as a tool for you to figure out what was going on, as much as it was for an opportunity for them to train. And you developed that tight squad because everybody had a say in what was happening and what was going on with developing the SOPs, because you were yourself trying to figure out how to develop SOPs. And that was that's what prompted the question about the collaborative environment. And that you said that all of those Marines together, you guys created an SOP. That led into the story about Colonel Berger coming out on a patrol with you in Fallujah, and how the OPSO came out and did basically interview patrols with everybody, and they picked your squad. And then you made a funny comment too, where you said, like, I was just praying we didn't take contact with General Berger in the patrol. And that's true, funny and true, I'm sure. And how impressive it was that he came out and showed up early and took an interest in watching your IA drills, not because he wanted to see, how a good squad operated, because he wanted to know what you were going to do if you did take contact. And then we talked about how great it was to have, the colonel come out there and bear the risk that the Marines that he was leading in combat had to bear. And he was willing to share that risk. And that meant a lot to you. I asked you about, that time with, there, but for the grace of God, walk I, and we had a pretty solemn discussion about the experience that you had in Fallujah, where there was an explosion and you were the reaction force and went out to help a squad that was ambushed, and you saw the KIAs coming out of the house, and there's a Marine that needed blood that you had the same blood type as, and you obviously donated blood. Then you had to go identify the KIA Marines, and how that was a defining moment for you, a formative moment, crystallizing moment, where you looked at the other squad leader and decided he was a great squad leader. He did everything right, but you decided that it was that moment that you saw the price that you pay for anything in combat. And you decided that was the moment in your life where you decided you were never going to take the easy way out ever again, training or anything else. And that was a very formative moment for you. We then went on to talk about a time when you were a first sergeant. I said, can you tell me about some of the really good officers that you met? And you talked about Major Nick Morales from India 37. You said that he taught you the meaning of discipline is not punishment. And you told me that then Major Morales was one, or maybe he was captain still at the time, he was one of the most consistent men I ever knew, is what you said. And then we got off onto a tangent about how lieutenants can sometimes compromise themselves by trying to be one of the boys. And Major Morales was really great at holding the officers accountable to a strict standard. And you talked about how he actually went so far as to refer to them by their call signs. So he was imprinting upon them the seriousness of what they were doing and the role that they carried in his infantry company. And that he actually made the lieutenants rehearse what they were going to say, not only rehearse the actual actions, but rehearse what they were going to say to the Marines, because he said that officers need to be, that those men, those officers, those lieutenants needed to be representative of a competent officer, and that they were projecting that competence to the Marines that they were leading by the way they were speaking and issuing their briefs. And that was an imprinting, informative moment for you too. And you said Major Morales showed you what right looked like. We then transitioned over to some stories about recruiting, leadership, and how it's a different form of leadership, and how you felt that humility and resiliency were two of the most important leadership traits that you were bringing into coming out of an infantry command and then into a recruiting command, and how much you respect the recruiters that are in your 4 states and the job that they do in selling the Marine Corps to the local people. And we had a quick conversation about measurement and how hard it is to lead when there's such strict measurement of things and the ability to measure. And you said that it's really forced you to become a very self-aware leader, and how, chewing ass doesn't necessarily work. And, you realize the requirement to actually coach, and that you can't just really yell at somebody and motivate them. In the recruiting world, you need to bring them back in and talk to them about how to do it better, and touch really quickly on leadership, coaching, and managing. And where leadership is, you get down there and you tell them, follow me. You can't really exercise that sort of leadership in the recruiting world. You're more coaching and managing at that point. And those are different things. And you've been learning how to do that as well. We talked about your social media and how that was set up to help recruiters and entice interest from the poolees. And it's really developed into a great communication tool that you're leveraging. And then we talked real quick about collaborating, a collaborative climate in an organization. You said, like, hey, the warning order is the time for the collaboration, but at some time the good idea machine has to stop, and leaders need to surface problems, introduce solutions, and then at some point the floor is closed and that's it. And you need to execute on your mission. And so I think what you were saying there was that there's a time and place for everything. And there's definitely a time and place for collaboration, but at some point there's not a time and place for collaboration anymore. And that's very true. And I agree with you on that. Then I asked the final question, is it important for Marines to like you? I kind of saved that one for the last because, I think it's an interesting question to ask a Sergeant Major. This really impacted me when you said that. You said, it's wrong to say, I don't care what people think of me. You need to ask yourself, what do you want to be liked for? And you need to figure out what those things are important to you, and what you're being liked for could be a lot of different things. You need to decide what they are for yourself. But to say that I don't care what people think of me is not the right way a leader should be thinking about being liked. It should be, what do you value and what do you stand for, and determining what it is that you want to be liked for. Sounds like then Captain Major Morales had figured out what he wanted to be liked for. And it certainly doesn't sound like he was trying to be liked for just being a good guy. He's trying to be liked for setting the standard and showing officers that you need to be projecting confidence, and also giving the company the confidence that they needed to have. And I suspect that he had figured out a long time before he took command what it was that he wanted to be liked for. And that kind of wrapped it up. I just want to tell everybody that the social media site, if you go to Instagram, it's at Norseman, NORSEMAN_9. I'll put it in the show notes below. But as we wrap up here, Sergeant Major, I just wonder if there's any last thing that we didn't hit on that you wanted to talk about.
No. No, I'm good.
Okay. There we go. Great. All right. I get a lot of feedback that people like the summary at the end. So there it is. But this has been an honor. I really appreciate your time. I think the leadership lessons and those moments in leadership that you just took the last 2 hours explaining to everybody are going to be taken very seriously by listeners, and hopefully put to good work, because you've had a very successful career, and you've led Marines in every climb and place. And I have the utmost respect for you, and I want to just tell you how much I really enjoy reading all of your stuff on social media, and I hope you keep that up.
Thanks, Dave.
Great. All right. Well, that will conclude this episode of Moments in Leadership. Thanks a lot for listening, and tune in again soon for our next episode. So with that, Sergeant Major, thanks again.
Thank you.